I think my writer friends sometimes concentrate on things that have been overwritten. Casper, Billy the Kid, Frank and Jesse James, those iconic, Wyatt Earp, those really iconic stories. And from a commercial standpoint, those are the ones that really sell because people recognize those names. And when you write a book about somebody like Valentine T. McGillycuddy, 90% of the people, 98% of the people have never even heard his name until you say, oh, well, he was the doctor who was with Crazy Horse when Crazy Horse was stabbed. Then a few more people know who that was, but they don't know him. But that's also what I was attracted to the story, because he really was involved in some very pivotal events. Valentine T. McGillycuddy was a gentleman. He grew up in Detroit, in Racine, Wisconsin, and became a doctor at a very young age. He was 20 years old when he became a doctor. And then he came out into the West because he wasn't very healthy, and he came into the West and started working as a topographer with the Northern Boundary Survey. Ultimately came into the Northern Plains in this region of Wyoming and on the Black Hills of South Dakota as a cartographer, an explorer, and a surgeon, a doctor. In 1875, he was back in Washington, D.C., drawing the maps that they had created with the Northern Boundary Survey when he got basically tapped on the shoulder and said, hey, would you be interested in going out on another expedition into the West? And he came into the Black Hills of South Dakota. In 1874, George Armstrong Custer led an expedition, a military expedition through the Black Hills, which was really sacred ground to the Lakota people. And while he was there, he found gold, his soldiers, and he found some gold. And so in 1875, they were going in with the Newton-Jenny expedition to see how much was there. McGillycuddy, in that expedition, he roamed all through the hills and drew the maps and did the recordings and the surveys. He worked with the geologists very closely. And so he got a real understanding of that place, and he fell in love with the Black Hills. It was the place of all the places that he traveled that was really his favorite place. He met Custer in 1872-73 on the Northern Survey. He didn't say a lot about him. He talked about him wearing a red shirt, which is interesting because Custer did wear a red shirt. And McGillycuddy, very fortunately for me, when I started working on the book, he kept a journal. And he was a very meticulous writer, and he was very detail-oriented, maybe partially because of his cartography skills, but and his doctrine, I suppose. He always kept very detailed notes. And so he spoke of Custer with his long hair and his red shirt. And that's really about the only impression that he had of him, other than that he had heard about the gold from him. And so, he had that impression of him. After the events that happened at the Little Bighorn in late June of 1876, McGillycuddy was then with Crook and treated some of the men who had been, obviously not with Custer because his immediate command was wiped out, but with other troops who were there. When they got to Camp Robinson, Red Cloud was already there. He had come into the reservation. He was not involved in any of the events at the Little Bighorn. And then in the spring of 1877, Crazy Horse and his band finally came in and surrendered. They'd been out all winter, very little food. They were struggling, and his wife was very ill. His wife was named Blackshaw. So McGillycuddy, being a surgeon at the camp, one of his roles was to take care of these Indians who had come in. Blackshaw being ill, McGillycuddy was very often in Crazy Horse's camp taking care of her. McGillycuddy's wife, Fanny, was also with him out at Camp Robinson, and she would go out to the Indian camps with him. So it was a doctor visit, and it was a friendly visit, because Fanny got to know the Indian women. They liked her, she liked them. And so they became, as McGillycuddy always said, Crazy Horse and I, we became friends. And so he knew Crazy Horse quite well, and he knew the immediate members of Crazy Horse's band by the time Crazy Horse was arrested and brought into Camp Robinson on that very fateful day in September of 1877. There are descriptions that McGillycuddy left of the day that Crazy Horse died, and how he was there when the Indians, when they brought him in, they brought Crazy Horse in, and they stopped in front of the guardhouse, and they're attempting to put Crazy Horse in the guardhouse. And when he realized that they're trying to arrest me, because he thought he was just coming in for a talk, He resisted, and that's when he was stabbed, maybe by a Lakota, maybe by an army military. That's never been really 100% conclusively determined. McGillycuddy talked about it a lot in later years, and it was written about, but he didn't personally write about it. And interestingly, Fanny, at that time, they kept a journal, and sometimes McGillycuddy wrote it, and sometimes Fanny wrote it. And at that time, Fanny was writing the journal, and she didn't mention anything about them bringing Crazy Horse in to Camp Robinson that day. She didn't say anything about McGillycuddy's role in caring for him that day. However, she did mention that after Crazy Horse died, he died late in the evening, 10, 11 at night, and his uncle, Touch the Clouds, was there with him, as well as his father, Worm. After he died, McGillycuddy went back to his quarters there at Camp Robinson. Touch the Cloud went with him and slept on the porch at their home there in the camp, most likely because he probably feared for the safety of McGillycuddy. The Indians were none too happy that Crazy Horse had just been killed. I mean, it was a really volatile day and night. And so by his presence there, it was like, don't harm this man. He tried his best to help. And so Fanny wrote about Touch the Cloud, McGillycuddy coming home late in the evening, and just this very cryptic remark that Crazy Horse was dead, not even mentioned him by name, but that Touch the Cloud slept on our porch that evening to watch over us. So that's really all that was written by the two of them personally. It's like you just want to shake him. It's like, what are you doing? You write these journals and you write letters and all of these reports constantly, and you don't write about the most important thing in your life. But looking at it through his lens, it was just another Indian to him. I mean, he knew who Crazy Horse was, and he knew he was a great leader. He knew all of that, but through the lens of the present, he didn't realize what the story of Crazy Horse would become in our generation and even earlier generations. He didn't realize that. I don't think he realized that. I don't think he really truly realized the significance of it until, even for him, and this all happened in 1877, and it was in the 1920s that he started really, as an older man, a much older man, started going back and rethinking, maybe some of the events that I was involved with were really pretty important. I started working on the book, and I started, I read everything I could find about McGillycuddy in other books. Of course, that's what you do. And there was always this mention of him in connection with Crazy Horse and with Red Cloud, because he had a real conflict with Red Cloud in his role. They had two different missions. Red Cloud was trying to preserve his culture and his people and their status in their world, and McGillycuddy was trying to implement the policies of the Indian Bureau and assimilate the Indians into white culture. And so it was just a natural conflict that happened. And when McGillycuddy became the agent on Pine Ridge, he was pushing the Indians into homes rather than into traditional lodges. So they were, building houses for them. They were building schools, boarding schools. They sent the children away to boarding schools, and some of them to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to the Indian boarding school there, some of them to boarding schools on the reservation. And he took the children out of their lives, really. They made the Indian children cut their hair, they made them wear white clothing, not traditional Indian things. They did, but some of the good things that McGillycuddy did is he also in many ways empowered the tribe, in that he established an Indian police force, the first Indian police force on a reservation that I'm aware of. And he had a Captain George Sword who was in charge of these Indian policemen, and they enforced the laws on the reservation, the reserve. It wasn't white enforcement, it wasn't military, and McGillycuddy never brought troops onto Pine Ridge while he was there. And that was something that at the time this, this great battle between these two really strong-willed men, both trying to do what they felt was right for their side. They later, and they hated each other. I mean, there's no question that they hated each other during that period. Later, though, during the Wounded Knee period in 1890, McGillycuddy was no longer at Pine Ridge. He'd been forced out. At that time, he was a private citizen appointed by the governor to serve with the National Guard in South Dakota, and he was sent to Wounded Knee before the events that were Wounded Knee, and there was this conflict over the ghost dance. And he tried very hard to get into the Indian camps because he felt like he could help. They knew him, and they, at that time, trusted him, and by then, Red Cloud was even asking for McGillycuddy. I mean, these two men who had just been at loggerheads years before, not that many years before, 5, 6 years before, they just practically wanted to kill each other. Now, Red Cloud was saying, let McGillycuddy come in. We trust him. We know him. He never brought troops onto the agency and the reservation, and McGillycuddy was trying to negotiate and was kept at a distance by the military. Maybe right, maybe wrong. I don't know if he would have ever been able to change things, but he was not there when the attack happened at Wounded Knee on Bigfoot's band, but he was there immediately after, and he cared, once again, he cared for the Indians. And so he was a friend of the Lakota and greatly hated by them at the same time. And even today, if you go on Pine Ridge and you mention the name Valentine T. McGillycuddy, you can get some fairly violent reactions because they felt that he did so much to try to take away their culture. And he did. He did. There's no denying that he did in doing the job that he was hired to do by the Indian Bureau. After his Indian service, his military and Indian service, he was in Rapid City. He was the first mayor of Rapid City. He was the first president of the School of Mines and Technology. No doubt drawn from his work in surveying the Black Hills and looking for that gold back in 1874 or 1875. And then he was 70 years old during the influenza epidemic of 1918 that killed so many people. He was living in California at the time, and he went back into work as a doctor, and he worked in mining camps in California and in Utah. He went to the Aleutian Islands and treated native Aleuts there who were suffering from this influenza epidemic. So he tried very hard, even when he was 60, 70 years old, to get back into the Indian service. He felt like he had things he could contribute because I think he did, especially by then, he knew and understood the Indian mindset. And as much as he and Red Cloud, had these violent incidents against each other when McGillycuddy was in charge of the agency and Red Cloud was trying to still run the tribe, in later years they both came to respect each other, at least to a certain degree. At Wounded Knee and right after Wounded Knee, Red Cloud wanted McGillycuddy there. He said, "You would understand us." And McGillycuddy, for his part, later said, I now understand, Red Cloud. I was young and I was aggressive in those days, and I was just going to do what I thought was right. Looking back on it now, though, I see why Red Cloud acted the way he did, and I understand his position, and I would have fought the agent just as hard had I been in his shoes. So, in later years, they did come to respect each other. They probably never bosom buddies, but they did come to respect each other. I would like readers to just understand that there are characters that helped set the tone for what was happening in the American West during that period of 1870 to 1890, that last bit of the real frontier, who were out here, who were trying hard to do a job. There are these stories that haven't been overtold, in my view. They haven't been overtold, and they're as interesting, as rich, as exciting, as dramatic as anything you would read about some of the more iconic figures of the West. And yet the iconic figures are in there. I mean, Custer's in McGillycuddy's story. Calamity Jane is in McGillycuddy's story. Bill Cody is in McGillycuddy's story. Certainly all the Indian leaders of the day, Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, Spotted Tail, Young Man Afraid of His Horses, Old Man Afraid of His Horses. Those folks were all there, and they were a cast of characters that were just going about their lives, their daily lives. And, you know, some things we consider heroic are folks just going around their daily lives and trying to do the best job that they could do, given the circumstances that they were in.